preparing to die.
You're looking at Gotcha, the very first arcade maze game released by Atari in 1973. It was Atari's second attempt to branch out from their success with Pong, but much like their previous effort Space Race, it was largely met with indifference. Indifference to the game, that is. The cabinet housing Gotcha was another matter entirely, because the cabinet housing Gotcha had tits. There you go. Tits on an arcade machine. And not just for decorative purposes, oh no, that'd be ridiculous. No, tits on an arcade machine that you use to play the game. By squeezing them. What in the name of God were they thinking? Atari backtracked pretty quickly over the design and replaced them with the more conventional joysticks that we know and sweatily caress today, which set the stage for two important developments in gaming history. First, no more tits on arcade machines. Seriously, what in the fuck, Atari? And second, and far uglier if you can believe that, moral controversy in video games. That's right, your no Russians, your plastic bag executions, your prostitute murdering, your chiropractically irresponsible fatalities, they all walk a timeline that leads back to this godless creation. But to be fair, the world at large didn't seem to be particularly outraged or offended by Gotcha. There was no national cry for action, no media frenzy or demands to salvage whatever small scrap of innocence that the youth of America were still clinging onto in this dark age of titted machines. Nobody was worried that their new VCR was going to turn up with a pair of balls you had to yank to set the timer. No, they'd cling on to that madness for what came next. By the end of 1975, future arcade giants Exidy were looking to capitalise on the success of their previous game, the vehicular combat smashathon Destruction Derby. Although popular, Exidy made little in the way of profit from Destruction Derby, thanks to a bum licensing deal with the near-bankrupt Chicago Coin, and decided to develop a similarly violent car-based title with one key difference. The player was no longer tasked with merely bludgeoning other road users with their own vehicles. Their new targets ran for their lives on 2 legs rather than 4 wheels. And they screamed. This is Death Race, released in 1976. It's a simple enough game to play. Run down as many of these panic-stricken stick figures as you can in the time allocated to you. To stop it from getting too easy, your victims leave little tombstones behind when they eat the cold steel of your fender, which you'll be forced to wriggle free from should you drive over them. The higher the score goes, the more littered the play area will become with the grave sites of the departed. There's a 2-player option that I can't seem to turn off in this emulated version, which handily exposes the complete lack of AI in this game. Look, they just can't fucking wait to die under his wheels. And he's not even moving. They're literally beating themselves to death on his hood. The original game assigned you a rank based on how many new memorials to the dead you'd got poking out of the motorway. 1 to 3 made you a skeleton chaser, 4 to 10 a bone cracker, 11 to 20 a gremlin hunter, and anything over 20 bestowed upon you the hallowed title of expert driver. Expert driver. Now, the more observant among you might have noticed that at no point there did I ever refer to your victims as people, and that's because, according to Exidy's official line on the matter at least, they're not. They're gremlins, or monsters as the promotional flyer describes them. Not people, monsters, that scream like people and are afforded a proper Christian burial. They look like people, run like people, The alleged working title for the game was Pedestrian. The actual title and theme of the game has more than a little in common with the 1975 Sylvester Stallone movie Death Race 2000, in which mowing down screaming human beings awarded competitors with points, but they're definitely not people. Even the driver of the player's own death wagon was open to interpretation, as an early press release encouraged you to imagine yourself as mobsters in the 30s, commandos in the 40s, or dragsters in the 50s. I personally like to envision myself as a mad hippie in the 60s whose brain is detonating in the middle of an LSD meltdown, hallucinating innocent people as gremlins or monsters that must meet death plastered to the hood of my Beetle. But hey, you can be whatever you want to be in Death Race. A burnt out Vietnam veteran in the 70s, a coked out advertising executive in the 80s, Matthew Broderick in the 90s, that shit's up to you. Much like Atari's Boobgate incident 3 years prior, Death Race raised some eyebrows when it was initially released, but aside from a handful of distributors refusing to run a contract, it certainly wasn't at the centre of any kind of moral consternation. Exidy had only intended the game to be a quick stopgap until their next title, Car Polo, was ready, with production limited to a mere 200 units. It was one of the many arcade games of the era sentenced to a relatively quick shuffle into obscurity, until a reporter from Seattle named Wendy Walker found the machine in her local mall and was horrified to see this murder simulator in the hands of a queue of children. Her article ran in the July 3rd, 1976 edition of the Daily Oregonian, and it lit enough dynamite under Mount Crap to unleash a veritable shitstorm avalanche. Every major newspaper and national interest magazine lined up to cover Death Race. NBC's popular weekend show wheeled out a psychiatrist to denounce the game's depictions of wanton violence. Even Atari co-founder Nolan Bushnell expressed his distaste, saying, "We were really unhappy with Death Race. Atari had an internal rule that we wouldn't allow violence against people. You could blow up a tank or you could blow up a flying saucer, but you couldn't blow up people. We felt that was not good form, and we adhered to that all during my tenure." Amusingly, that very same year, Atari had released Outlaw, a game orientated around putting a bullet in your very human opponent before he did the same to you. Outlaw was a response to Midway's Gunfight, released the year before, which used exactly the same theme. In the midst of the furore against Death Race, one appalled arcade owner explained to the Tuscan Daily Citizen why a morally upstanding citizen could justify gunfights in humanity against Exidy's monstrosity. That's the tradition of the great American West, having a shootout, a duel in the street, but deliberately running people down? That isn't an American tradition at all. Death is a brittle thing to portray in any form of media. How acceptable it can seem is directly tied to how comfortable its audience is with its context. A strong number of family-rated westerns or war movies have more gratuitous on-screen body counts than most slasher movies, but as a society, we've grown familiar with those scenarios. Joker, if you please.
If tomorrow I tell the press that, like, a gangbanger will get shot, or a truckload of soldiers will be blowing up, nobody panics. Because it's all part of the plan. But when I say that one little old mare will die, well, then everyone loses their minds.
Indeed. Just as nobody thought twice about a game where the player is devoured by sharks. The year before Death Race came to market, Atari released the world's first unofficial movie tie-in, Shark Jaws. Yes, one of those words certainly is much more prominent than the other. Well done you. Atari had tried and failed to acquire the rights to the movie Jaws from Universal, but pressed on with the release anyway under a hidden subsidiary company called Horror Games to minimise the damage of any potential lawsuits. It wasn't a new practice for Atari. Key Games had been set up by Bushnell 2 years prior to double their profits by selling clones of their own games to finicky arcade distributors who demanded exclusivity contracts. Funnily enough, Shark Jaws' arcade ancestor can be seen in the movie Jaws itself, an electromechanical shooter by Sega called Killer Shark, in which the idea is to harpoon the fin-wearing bastard before it gets you. However, the mechanics of shark jaws were pure survival. Grab as many fish as you can before the great white eats you. You really have to wonder what's so urgent about grabbing these fish that this man would be trying to outmaneuver one of nature's most perfect predators to do it. But hey, if outswimming a shark is as easy as this game makes it out to be, why not? The damn thing should come with a self-esteem meter. After enough botched attempts at ripping you in half, the shark would swim off to kill itself in a boat propeller. The shark theme proved popular going forward, with Project Support Engineering's Man-Eater appearing the same year in just the most insanely awesome cabinet design, Pacific Novelty's Deep Death in 1980, and Shark for the Commodore PET, in which you actually play as the shark itself trying to devour swimmers on a beach. I could never figure out how the fuck Shark worked. You're the upside down T, and the swimmers are the circles, but every time you move they just teleport 100 feet away from you and escape. You can change the settings to increase the number of swimmers to give yourself a chance, but god damn it's confusing. Jaws inadvertently gave horror its first route into the arcades and gaming as we know it today, just as Death Race lit the torch for illicit violence and morbidity. The only thing that the negative publicity from Death Race did to Exidy was drive their sales up to a cool $3 million a year, and once the media lost interest in its own mania, it had only served to aid the public in their first baby steps towards desensitivity. In 1980, the two worlds crossed over in Shark Attack, which was actually the aforementioned Deep Death on a re-release license to a company called Game Plan, headed by the guy who used to design pinball tables for the company that dodged Exidy's Destruction Derby royalty payments, Chicago Coin. Small fucking world. Shark Attack had you devouring waves of scuba divers for points, their bodies dissolving into a graphic bloody mess between your jaws. There was even a cassette player in the arcade cabinet that would play actual human screams every time you tore one of them apart. Nobody batted an eyelid. It's hard to believe the fuss that was made over Death Race in 1976 when you consider that by 79 the Apple II was rocking games like Bloody Murder, where the objective was to literally throw knives at people and watch them collapse, curse your name with their dying breath, and then bleed out all over the fucking floor. But changes of all kinds were coming quickly as gaming flew out of its infancy, not least in the emerging home microcomputer market. Next time, we'll look at the birth of PC gaming, and an extremely rare and little known title that may well lay claim to being the world's first survival horror game.
See it at High Technology, the computer.